When we are asked to describe others, we refer to the prominent traits of their personality, saying they're friendly, funny, or hardworking. But what does all this actually mean? Personality is defined as one's personal style of interaction, which can be conversing or fighting with the world and others. Your personality is made of traits or predispositions to behave a certain way, which is relatively consistent throughout situations and stable over time. In a 2000 study by Roberts and Delvacchio that measured heritability, phenotypic variation in a trait attributable to genetics of personality through analyzing measures across 7-year periods, they found that the correlation coefficient of personality in childhood measured 0.31, meaning that it has a moderate positive correlation. In contrast, the correlation coefficient of personality between the ages of 50 and 70 was 0.74, which indicates a strong positive correlation. Thus, the study provides evidence that personality is stable over time. However, its stability increases over time, which can be associated with increased maturity. So how exactly do we measure personality? Factor analysis is a statistical procedure that utilizes statistical correlations of two traits to create a manageable set of characteristics that are unique. For example, the traits kind and nice would have a high correlation. The more kind someone is, the nicer they tend to be as well. And thus, the two traits would be grouped together in the same category. Through factor analysis, studies have discovered the 5-factor theory of personality, commonly measured through the neo-personality inventory, which I will delve into a bit later. The 5-factor theory consists of 5 categories, each of which encompasses 6 facets. Agreeableness measures one's sympathy and ability to act unselfishly, including the facets of trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. Neuroticism measures emotional stability. The higher the score, the more likely one is to switch between emotions. Its facets include anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, impulsivity, and vulnerability. Extroversion takes into account the frequency and intensity of interactions with others. Its facets are warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement, and positivity. Conscientiousness measures goal-oriented self-control abilities. Its facets seek competency, order, dutifulness, achievement, self-discipline, and deliberation. Finally, openness refers to the inclination to seek out new experiences, including fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, actions, ideas, and values. Scores on these 5 categories are a significant measure of personality. I previously mentioned that traits are relatively stable throughout. However, studies have demonstrated that agreeableness tends to increase over time, as does conscientiousness. In contrast, openness and neuroticism tend to decrease. Extroversion remains at relatively the same level. Researchers have determined that there are more characteristics outside the Big Five which can affect one's personality. Some have focused on the dark triad of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellism, accounting for negative personality traits beyond what is socially acceptable. Psychopathy encompasses immoral or antisocial behavior, along with a lack of empathy and inability to form meaningful relationships. Those scoring high on the Machiavellism factor tend to manipulate others. Narcissism is defined as one's extreme selfishness and grandiose view of one's abilities, including a need for admiration. We think of a person who is self-absorbed as narcissistic, hence the mirror. However, there is one more big trait: grit. Grit takes into account one's consistency of interest and perseverance of effort in accomplishing a task. In a 2007 study, Duckworth and colleagues determined that grit made a 4% difference in success in Ivy League undergraduates. So how does this all play into the real world? Earlier, I mentioned the neo-personality inventory. It includes more than 200 statements in which one ranks each on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. For example, rating you agree with the statement, "I follow a strict schedule." From those questions, it assesses your personality for the Big 5 traits. I found a Big 5 personality test online and asked one of my friends to take it. Above are the results from the survey that she took, and below are the results for when I was taking the survey according to how I perceive her. There have been shown to be a few correlations between how you score on the neo-personality inventory and how one lives. For example, those scoring high on conscientiousness tend to perform higher in jobs and obtain higher grades. People who score high in neuroticism are susceptible to mental health issues. Thus, personality plays a role in future behavior and how we perceive stimuli. Self-esteem, our perception of how much others approve of us, is a critical element of how we define ourselves, or self-concept. Depending on the reference group, the group you're comparing yourself against, your self-esteem may lower with the group beyond you or become higher with the group that is below you, called the big fish and small pond effect. You might have noticed that when scoring personality tests, my friend and I both took the test for one person. Personality tests require a lot of honesty and insight, and bias always plays a factor in answering these questions. It is easy to manipulate your answers for what you would like to see, so often when measuring, researchers have friends take the test according to your personality as well to have a more holistic review. There are several biases that play into your self-concept as well, enhancing your self-esteem. Self-serving attributional bias associates good fortunes with your own skills and adverse events with external causes. Positive illusory bias explains that one tends to overestimate one's own abilities. Underneath that category falls the better than average effect, where a person overestimates one's skills in comparison to others. In fact, in 1995 and 1977 studies by Alec and Cross respectively, researchers found that 94% of professors believed they were better than the average professor. Further, the selective memory bias helps you remember the positive or negative events. All of these together lead to the overinflation of self-concept proportionally to what one actually accomplishes, and thus one often views themselves as higher than how others perceive them. You might be thinking about your reference group and distinguishing between each member of your in-group, the group you belong to. Why is it that everyone is different? Your genes are the main factor in determining personality. In fact, in twin studies which analyze the heritability of personality through comparing the similarity of identical twins to fraternal twins, have determined that the heritability is around 0.5. Meaning that 50% of our differences in personality are attributable to our genetics. The remaining 50% is attributed to the environment. But why are identical twins still different if raised in the same environment? Through studying twins, researchers found that they were as different raised together versus apart, meaning that the environment has an almost negligible effect because two people can interpret the same experiences in various manners, affecting their personality. These differences have evolutionarily helped. A mechanism called natural selection favors the traits which are more fit, producing more offspring. With a variety of traits, diverse personalities can excel in different areas for an alternative strategy to survive and reproduce. We like to focus on the differences between two people when describing them. When children are raised in the same family, they also try to focus on their unique characteristics to reduce rivalry and share a diverse parental investment. One of the ways that siblings separate from each other is sibling contrast. Within a family, they place emphasis on differences between two siblings. Another phenomenon, split parent identification, follows that if a parents have a child, which let's say identifies with the mother, the following child will tend to identify with the father. The psychodynamic theory of personality relies on the unconscious motivations which cause a person to behave a certain way. Sigmund Freud was a leading figure, and he explained that people use defense mechanisms to guard against anxiety. One defense mechanism is repression, when one initially has anxiety-producing thoughts that he or she pushes out of his or her conscience. Displacement turns an unconscious, unacceptable thought into a more acceptable alternative. For example, if one is interested in punishment, they can use it for social purposes such as being a lawyer, which is a specific subsection of displacement called sublimation. Projection reflects one's unacceptable unconscious thoughts onto others. Reaction formation converts a frightening wish into its opposite. For example, strongly loving someone may be scary, and that is converted to hatred. Rationalization uses logic to come up with an explanation of erratic behavior. The defense mechanisms act independently or in conjunction with each other to prevent cognitive dissonance, being uncomfortable with challenging thoughts. In contrast to the psychodynamic theory of personality, which focuses on the unconscious aspects, the humanistic theory focuses on the conscious understanding of self. A prominent figure in the humanistic theory was Maslow in his pyramid, which I will show here. At the bottom are physiological needs such as food and shelter. Above that is basic safety. Further up is attachment, forming meaningful relationships with family, etc. Above is esteem, confidence in oneself abilities. And at the top is self-actualization, which is the jackpot. Self-actualization is reaching one's full potential in life. Maslow argued that one must fulfill all the needs of one level before going up a step, and ultimately the goal of life is self-actualization. Personality disorders are a prominent issue in modern society. Cleveland Clinic estimates that around 10 to 13% of the world suffers from personality disorder, an enduring pattern of behavior, thoughts, and actions that impair a person's sense of self. Personality disorders are often dystonic, meaning that one does not have insight into their own condition. The three categories of personality disorders are Cluster A, Cluster B, Cluster C. Cluster A is characterized by odd thinking or behavior and includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster B displays emotional dramatic behavior that is unstable, including antisocial, borderline histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. Lastly, Cluster C is characterized by fear and anxiety and includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. Here are some symptoms which characterize each personality disorder. Notice that there are some overlaps between each personality disorder. Genetics can be a predisposing cause, which precedes the disorder and makes one more susceptible. You may inherit a certain personality trait from your parents. The pathways of the brain and structural integrity plays a role in behavior, as the brain processes and controls motor function. Your nervous system transfers messages throughout the brain through action potentials between neurons, nerve cells. The message is relayed between two neurons through neurotransmitters, which are specific for a particular function. For example, dopamine controls emotional responses. A lack of dopamine between synapses, the gap between two neurons, can cause depressive mood swings. The environment can be a precipitating cause, which are immediate causes that trigger the disorder. For example, abuse and violence may cause one to develop a personality disorder. All of these factors together can lead to a personality disorder. A common treatment for personality disorders is psychotherapy, talk and behavioral therapies that target the psychological aspect of mental disorders. For example, for borderline personality disorder, a behavioral therapy approach might be favored. It is based on classical conditioning, first described through Pavlov's dog experiment, in which he rang a bell and offered the dog food, and eventually the dog began salivating when just the bell was rung, without providing food. However, if the food is taken away in several successive sections, the dog will stop responding, called extinction, when the stimulus elicits less response. Similarly, habituation is a decline in the magnitude of a reflex when the stimulus is repeated. The goal of behavioral therapy is to habituate or extinguish a reflex. For borderline personality disorder, this would be used to control risk behaviors, reducing impulsive reflexes. Some common factors and positive outcome are the support, hope, and motivation to get better, originating from the therapist to transfer the energy to the client. Another pharmacological approach is through antidepressants. Serotonin, a mood regulator neurotransmitter in normal function, is reuptaken through to the presynaptic neuron. However, antidepressants prevent this reuptake, and thus increase the amount of serotonin in the synapse that is able to regulate mood. As mood swings are another characteristic of borderline personality disorder, antidepressants would help control mood swings. In order to study some of the biological factors which contribute to the onset of personality disorders, researchers used structural MRI scan, a type of imaging in which you are inserted into a machine which produces a magnetic field which stimulates protons to match, and when the field is removed, the protons spin in their normal direction and emit energy. Thus, it measures the structural integrity of brain regions. While it has good spatial resolution, looking at the shape and volume, it is measured at a single point in time, so temporal resolution depending on the time is not applicable. A 2007 article, Borderline Personality Disorder and Emotion Regulation, discussed that in patients with borderline personality disorder, researchers found that through MRI scans, that regions in the limbic system of the brain, the amygdala and hippocampus, used to process emotion and regulating emotion respectively, were smaller, thought to be a result of the stress that patients endure from the disorder. The structural difference gives some insight into what can cause this erratic behavior. In the future, we can specifically target treatment and prevention to these specific regions of the brain.